In the first month of the 40th year, the congregation of Israel walked into the barren desert of Zin, buried Miriam in the dust, and realized immediately that there was no water left to drink. A prophet who had parted a sea and collapsed a world empire now faces a thirsty, desperate, and grieving mob. He lifts a piece of wood, strikes a stone twice, and water floods the camp. But before the dry ground can even swallow the runoff, the God of Israel hands down a sudden, absolute death sentence. Stop right there. Picture it. The man who spent 4 decades carrying a rebellious, stiff-necked nation on his back makes one frustrated, violent motion, and he is permanently barred from the promised land. The central mystery of the desert is why an act of obedience 40 years earlier becomes an unpardonable treason here in the sand. Let the canonical text of Numbers chapter 20 frame the breaking of Moses. The King James Version reads, "And Moses lifted up his hand, and with his rod he smote the rock twice, and the water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their beasts also. And the Lord spake unto Moses and Aaron, Because ye believed me not, to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore ye shall not bring this congregation into the land which I have given them." Read that again. Water came out abundantly. The people lived. The cattle survived. The physical crisis was entirely solved. Yet the spiritual verdict from heaven was immediate, final, and devastating. Moses is told he did not believe, and he did not sanctify. There is no appeal. There is no second chance. See the scene, the old prophet standing by the rushing water, the wood still vibrating in his grip, the realization washing over him that his journey ends on the wrong side of the Jordan River. To understand what actually shattered that day at the waters of Meribah, we have to look past the English translation and into the ancient Jewish understanding of this landscape. The rabbinic commentaries of the Midrash Rabbah, preserving traditions far older than the ink they were written with, insist that this drought was not a natural weather pattern. I hold this as their telling, not as proven fact, but they tie the vanishing of the water directly to the woman who was just put in the ground. Numbers 20, verse 1, records the death of Miriam. Verse 2 immediately records the lack of water. In the Western mind, these are two completely disconnected historical events, separated by a simple paragraph break. In the Hebrew mind, they are the exact same crisis, same desert, same grief. The people turn on Moses. They wish they had died with their brethren. They weaponize their thirst against the man who led them out of slavery, demanding a miracle he does not have the strength to perform on his own. He falls on his face before the door of the tabernacle, waiting for the glory of the Lord to appear. And the Lord gives him a very specific set of instructions. Take a rod, gather the assembly, speak to the rock, but Moses strikes it. The punishment feels brutally disproportionate to the crime. If he brought the water, why does he lose the land? To find the real infraction, you have to look backward. You have to travel to another desert, another thirst, and another stone. The judgment at Zin makes no logical sense in isolation. The desert is demanding we look at a parallel crisis that happened 4 decades before this dark day. What did God command Moses to do to a rock at the very beginning of the wilderness journey? 40 years before the morning at Zin, a younger prophet stands in the wilderness of Sin at an encampment called Rephidim, facing the exact same fury. The mud of the Red Sea is barely dry on the sandals of the Israelites. The Egyptian chariots are still settling into the silt, but the desert is unforgiving. The water skins are empty, and the congregation is gathering stones to kill the man who led them here. Moses cries out to heaven in desperation, and the God of Israel gives an explicit, violent command. Exodus chapter 17, verses 5 and 6 inches, the King James. And the Lord said unto Moses, Go on before the people, and take with thee of the elders of Israel, and thy rod wherewith thou smotest the river take in thine hand, and go. Behold, I will stand before thee there upon the rock in Horeb, and thou shalt smite the rock, and there shall come water out of it, that the people may drink. Stop right there. Thou shalt smite the rock. The instruction is physical. It requires impact. Moses obeys. He lifts the staff of judgment, the same wood that shattered Pharaoh's empire, the same branch that turned the Nile into a ribbon of blood, and he brings it crashing down onto the stone of Horeb. Notice the strange detail buried in verse 6. God says, I will stand before thee there upon the rock. Read that again. God places his own presence on the stone. When Moses brings the rod of judgment down, he is not just breaking granite, he is striking the very place where the glory of the Almighty rests. The rock absorbs the blow of the law, and life-giving water flows out to save a rebellious people. It is a perfect, finished equation. The rock splits, the water rushes, the people live. Picture the scene. Moses is vindicated. The elders witness the miracle. God is glorified through the strike. Now, lay that victory at Rephidim beside the tragedy at Zin. At the beginning of the wandering, striking the rock is the pinnacle of faithful obedience. At the end of the wandering, striking the rock is a cosmic offense that permanently revokes Moses' entry into the land of Canaan. Same crisis, opposite verdict. If striking the rock was commanded in Exodus, why does it condemn him in Numbers? The paradox seems cruel. It makes the God of the desert appear volatile, changing the rules of survival without warning. But the text is not erratic. The text is painfully precise. Watch what the text does. Western readers tend to flatten the biblical landscape. We assume a rock is just a rock, water is just water, and a stick is just a stick. We read the English word rock in Exodus 17 and the English word rock in Numbers 20, and our minds paint the exact same boulder sitting in the sand. We think Moses just repeated a magic trick he learned 4 decades earlier, but he did not. The biblical authors never intended for you to see the same object. The English language has masked a massive shift in the terrain. The rod Moses held at Zin was not the same rod he held at Horeb. The command he received was not the same command. And most importantly, the physical object towering over him in the desert of Zin was an entirely different creation. 2 thirsts, separated by 40 years of wandering. The English translation paints the same boulder in both deserts, but the Hebrew scroll reveals a geographical and spiritual difference that changes everything. What exactly was standing in front of Moses at the waters of Meribah? Unroll the Hebrew scroll of Exodus. Run your finger across the ink of chapter 17 and look at the shape of the letters. When God commands Moses to strike the stone at Horeb, the word carved into the text is tzur. A tzur is a boulder. It is a sharp, flinty rock sitting low to the earth. It is an object a man can stand beside, raise a heavy piece of wood over his head, and strike downward upon with physical force. But carry that scroll 40 years forward to the desert of Zin. Read Numbers chapter 20, verse 8, in the King James. Take the rod, and gather thou the assembly together, thou and Aaron thy brother, and speak ye unto the rock before their eyes, and it shall give forth his water. Stop right there. Look at the Hebrew word for rock in this verse. It is not tzur, it is selah. A selah is a towering cliff face. It is an elevated crag, a high fortress of stone rising out of the sand, casting a long shadow over the thirsty congregation. When King David later writes in Psalm 18, "The Lord is my rock and my fortress," the word he uses for that high, impenetrable fortress is Selah. Two words, two objects, two entirely different landscapes. Picture it. Moses is not standing over a low boulder in the dirt. He is standing at the base of a massive, silent cliff. God did not command him to hit a fortress with a wooden stick. He commanded him to use his voice, to speak to the high place before the eyes of the entire assembly. The English translation flattens the topography, making us think Moses simply misapplied an old command to an old, familiar object. But the Hebrew text exposes a man completely ignoring his present reality. He is so blinded by his own grief over Miriam, so trapped in the trauma of 40 years of Israel's rebellion, that he treats a towering cellar as if it were a lowly tzur. He violently strikes a high cliff face twice, an act of physical absurdity born of pure rage. Watch what the text does. It forces us to see that the landscape of deliverance had changed. The object of grace had elevated. The flinty boulder of Exodus had been replaced by the majestic cliff of Numbers. Sit with that. But this realization opens a gaping hole in the narrative of the wandering. If these are two entirely different geological formations, separated by 4 decades and hundreds of miles of hostile terrain, how did Israel survive the time in between? The canonical record is startlingly quiet about thirst between Exodus 17 and Numbers 20. For 39 years, an entire nation of men, women, and livestock walked through a scorching wasteland without a single recorded drought. The water at Horeb flowed, and then the text goes silent on the issue of thirst until the very month they arrive at Zin. A nation cannot survive 39 years in the desert on the memory of one shattered boulder. There must have been a constant, enduring source. The silence of those 39 years holds a massive, unspoken provision. The ancient Jewish writings refuse to leave that gap empty, tying the hidden water source directly to the woman just buried in the sand of Zin. What exactly vanished from the camp the moment Miriam took her final breath? The dust settles over a fresh grave in Kadesh, and instantly, the camp goes dry. Numbers chapter 20 begins with a collision of two tragedies that the King James Version binds together in a single breath. Verses 1 and 2 establish the scene. Then came the children of Israel, even the whole congregation, into the desert of Zin in the first month, and the people abode in Kadesh. And Miriam died there and was buried there, and there was no water for the congregation. Stop right there. To a modern reader, a death and a drought are two completely separate historical events. To the ancient Jewish mind, one caused the other. The rabbinic scholars looked at the white space between verse 1 and verse 2 and saw a profound, devastating link. This connection is preserved in Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, an ancient Aramaic paraphrase of the Torah read in the synagogues of the 1st century. I offer it as that, one tradition's record, not a canonical decree. The Targum claims that for 39 years, Israel did not have to search for hidden oases in the sand. God provided a miraculous, rolling well of water, a stone that physically traveled with the camp through the hostile wasteland. And this traveling stone was given specifically for the merit of Moses' sister. They called it the Well of Miriam. Picture it. A physical stone moving across the desert floor, stopping when the Ark of the Covenant stopped, cracking open in the valleys to pour out rivers, sustaining millions of people and beasts. For 4 decades, wherever Miriam walked, the water followed, but the moment she stops breathing in Kadesh, the rock stops rolling. The water vanishes. The miracle dies with the woman. Read that again. Moses is not just facing an angry mob with empty water skins. He is standing over the fresh grave of his sister, grieving his own blood, while the very miracle tied to her life disappears into the dust. The psychological trauma is absolute. The panic in the camp is immediate and violent. Numbers 20, verses 3 and 4, records the assault. And the people chode with Moses, and spake, saying, Would God that we had died when our brethren died before the Lord? And why have ye brought up the congregation of the Lord into this wilderness, that we and our cattle should die there? Listen to their terror. They are mourning. The grace they relied on for a lifetime is gone. And in the middle of this profound loss, God tells Moses to gather the people and speak to the towering Selah, the high cliff face, to bring the water back. The flinty boulder of Horeb was in the past. The rolling well of Miriam is gone. Now, Moses is commanded to use nothing but his voice to unlock a new, elevated source of life. But a traveling, water-giving rock is an absurd image for the Western mind. It sounds like pure myth, a rabbinic fairy tale invented to explain a geographical gap in the text. Except a first-century Jewish rabbi who wrote a third of the New Testament did not think it was a fairy tale at all. He believed it was a historical reality, and he gave the rolling stone a name. Turn the scroll forward 1,000 years. A Pharisee of Pharisees sits in the ancient world, writing a letter to a church in the Greek city of Corinth. He is a scholar, trained at the feet of Gamaliel, breathing the very air of the ancient Jewish traditions, the Targums, and the Midrash. He knows the stories of the rolling well. He knows the legend of the traveling water. And he does not dismiss it as a desert myth. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 4 inches, the King James reads, And did all drink the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. Stop right there. Read that again. That followed them. The Apostle Paul does not write that they drank from static puddles or random oases. He explicitly writes that the rock itself was in motion. He takes the ancient rabbinic tradition of the traveling stone, the physical object that moved with Israel through the hostile wasteland, and he stamps it with canonical authority. He validates the moving water. But watch what the text does. Paul strips away the merit of Moses' sister and places the weight of the water entirely on the Messiah. The stone that poured out life in the wilderness was not powered by Miriam. It was a pre-incarnate shadow of Christ himself. Same desert, new revelation. Picture it. The congregation marches, the pillar of cloud leads, and the stone follows. For nearly 40 years, it pours out rivers in the wasteland, sustaining millions of people and beasts without a single strike, without a single command. It is pure, rolling grace. I hold this as one reading, a bridge between rabbinic memory and apostolic doctrine. But if Paul is right, then the sudden vanishing of the water at Kadesh takes on a terrifying weight. The water stops. The people riot. The grace seems to have abandoned them just when the morning begins. The prophetic picture had to shift. The physical, rolling provision halts because the era of the high cliff face, the Selah, has arrived. The people are on the border of the inheritance. God tells Moses to assemble the congregation and speak to the elevated rock. No violence, no striking, just the voice of the mediator asking the high place to yield its water. But Moses is blinded by grief and fury. He does not see the shadow of the Messiah. He sees an ungrateful mob that just insulted his dead sister. He lifts his arm to strike the cliff, yet the physical object he brings crashing down against the Selah hides another layer of the mystery. We assume Moses raised his own staff, the rod of judgment, the wood that shattered Egypt and split the Red Sea. We assume he used the same weapon of wrath he used at Horeb. Reading, not inventing. Look closely at the exact command God gives in Numbers 20, and where Moses actually retrieves the wood. The text reveals that the stick in his hand did not belong to him. Whose rod was Moses holding when he broke the heart of God at the waters of Meribah? Step past the veil of the tabernacle into the suffocating quiet of the holy place and watch where Moses reaches his hand. Numbers 20, verses 8 and 9, in the King James. Take the rod, and gather thou the assembly together. And Moses took the rod from before the Lord, as he commanded him. Stop right there. From before the Lord. That phrase is a massive geographical clue. Moses carried his own shepherd's staff everywhere he walked. It was the wood of his authority, the stick he leaned on in the dirt, the weapon he used to call down plagues upon the Nile. He did not store it in the sanctuary. But the rod he retrieves in this moment is not leaning against his own tent. It is resting deep inside the sacred architecture, stationed deliberately in front of the Ark of the Covenant. Watch what the text does. It forces us to cross-reference a crisis that happened just 3 chapters earlier. In Numbers 17, after a brutal rebellion led by Korah, God commanded the leaders of the 12 tribes to lay a dead, severed branch inside the tabernacle. He promised to choose one man to lead, and the proof would be impossible. The next morning, only one branch miraculously sprouted to life, pushing out buds, blooming into blossoms, and yielding ripe, heavy almonds. It belonged to the high priest, and Numbers 17, verse 10, gives a permanent, binding decree. And the Lord said unto Moses, Bring Aaron's rod again before the testimony, to be kept for a token against the rebels. Read that again. Aaron's rod was the only piece of wood canonically mandated to be stored before the Lord. Picture it. God does not tell Moses to take his own staff of wrath. He commands him to enter the holy place and retrieve his brother's rod of resurrection. The distinction is absolute. The wood of Moses brought darkness to Egypt. The wood of Aaron brought life out of a dead branch. 2 pieces of wood, 2 different natures. Grace, not judgment. God tells Moses to take the symbol of resurrection, stand before the towering Selah, and speak life out of the stone. This is one reading, not the final word, but the visual theology is staggering. He is supposed to hold up a dead branch that miraculously blossomed by the breath of God, and simply ask the high cliff to do the exact same thing. Sit with that. But the trauma of the desert breaks the prophet. Moses takes the rod of grace, marches out of the tabernacle, and wields it exactly like the rod of judgment. He uses the wood of resurrection as a weapon of physical wrath. He brings the almond branch crashing down against the cliff face, twice, trying to force the miracle through violence rather than asking for it through faith. When you use the tools of grace to strike the people of God, the water might still flow for the congregation, but the spiritual cost to the striker is total. Yet the physical blow against the stone is only half the treason at Meribah. The wood in his hand was wrong, but the words in his mouth were far worse. Centuries later, a poet of Israel reads the ancient record and identifies a completely different crime. A verbal theft so severe, it stole the glory of the Almighty. What exactly did Moses scream at the crowd when he raised that branch? The roar of the thirsty congregation echoes off the high cliff face at Kadesh. Moses stands at the base of the cellar, gripping the blossomed wood of his brother, breathing in the dust and the fury of a people who have accused him for 40 years. He opens his mouth to speak, but he does not speak to the stone. He screams at the bride of God. Numbers chapter 20, verse 10 inches, the King James. And Moses and Aaron gathered the congregation together before the rock, and he said unto them, Hear now, ye rebels, must we fetch you water out of this rock? Stop right there. Look at the terrifying pronoun buried in the center of his rage. Must we fetch you water? Moses does not say, Must the Lord provide for you? He does not invoke the name of Jehovah. In a moment of absolute, blinding exhaustion, the prophet inserts himself into the architecture of the miracle. He shares the credit. He claims the power. Read that again. He makes himself the source. For 40 years, Moses had been the hollow instrument of the Almighty, a conduit for plagues and parted seas. But here, standing over the grave of his sister, the trauma finally breaks his humility. He takes the weight of provision upon his own shoulders. He steals the glory of the divine. Hundreds of years after the desert sand swallowed the rebellious generation, a poet of Israel sat down to write the spiritual autopsy of this exact moment. Look at how the book of Psalms diagnoses the fatal error. Psalm 106, verses 32 and 33 inches, the King James. They angered him also at the waters of strife, so that it went ill with Moses, for their sakes, because they provoked his spirit, so that he spake unadvisedly with his lips. Lips, not hands. Sit with that. The psalmist completely ignores the physical striking of the stone. The poet focuses entirely on the verbal treason. Moses provoked the Spirit of God because he spoke unadvisedly. When God hands down the sentence, in Numbers 20, his precise indictment is, "Because ye believed me not, to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel." To sanctify means to set apart as holy, to elevate God as the sole, uncontested source of life. By screaming, "Must we?" Moses profaned the miracle. He told a grieving, desperate nation that the water depended on the mood and the power of two old men. Picture the scene. The water gushes from the cliff face. The people rush forward to drink. The livestock plunge their mouths into the rushing stream. But the air between Moses and heaven is completely shattered. The physical need of the congregation is met, but the spiritual reality has been corrupted. Yet, even the wrong rod and the stolen glory do not fully explain the permanence of the punishment. God is fiercely merciful. He forgave Aaron for building the golden calf. He forgave Miriam for inciting rebellion. Why is this single, compounded failure at the cliff face unforgivable? Because Moses did not just break a command. He broke a living, breathing prophecy. The rock in the desert was never just a physical object. It was a shadow of an eternal rescue that was only designed to endure the rod of judgment once. What exactly happens when a prophet strikes the shadow of the Messiah a second time? The heavy wood of Aaron's almond rod connects with the sheer face of the cellar. The sharp crack of splintering bark echoes across the desert of Zin. He swings again. A second violent blow against the stone. Water erupts from the fracture, flooding the dust, saving the animals and the people. But in the unseen realm, a fragile, divine architecture completely collapses. Look through the lens the Apostle Paul left us. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 declared the traveling stone was a shadow of the Messiah. If the rock is Christ, then the actions taken against the rock are not just survival tactics in a wasteland. They are a living, breathing prophecy. A divine play staged in the sand, designed to teach 1 million newly freed slaves how redemption actually works. Go back to the first thirst at Horeb. God commanded the strike. The low boulder, the tzur, absorbed the physical blow of the rod of judgment so that life could flow to the guilty. It is a flawless, bloodless picture of the crucifixion. Judgment falls on the substitute. The innocent stone is broken for the rebellious nation. But that strike was designed to happen exactly once. Fast forward 40 years to the desert of Zin. The landscape of deliverance has shifted. The low boulder is gone. The rock has been elevated. It is now Selah, the high cliff face, towering over the congregation. Picture it. This is the visual theology of the ascended Messiah. He has already absorbed the blow. He has already been struck at Horeb. He is now the high fortress. And how do you draw life from an ascended, exalted source? You speak to it. This is the profound beauty of God's command in Numbers 20. Take the wood of resurrection, assemble the bride, and speak. No violence, no wrath. The era of striking is over. Grace is now accessed by the voice, by the simple asking. Read that again. The strike was for the beginning of the journey. The voice was for the end. I offer this as one reading, the apostolic lens laid precisely over the ancient Hebrew text. But if this typology holds, then Moses's crime at Kadesh is astronomically terrifying. By striking the sailor, Moses is telling 1,000,000 Israelites that the first strike was not enough. By hitting it twice, he is physically testifying that the high, exalted rock must be beaten again and again to yield its grace. He took God's perfect, once-for-all portrait of redemption, and he vandalized it with a stick of almond wood. The people drank the water, but they drank a corrupted prophecy. Moses destroyed the visual revelation of grace. He was the greatest prophet of the Old Covenant, the man who spoke to God face to face. But God will not allow anyone, not even his closest friend, to ruin the picture of his Son without consequence. The sentence must match the severity of the shattered shadow. Moses is permanently barred from the promised land. Yet the judgment at the cliff face is not simply the anger of a volatile deity. It is the tragic, necessary cost of guarding the sacred text. And when the dust finally settles over the camp, we have to look at what God actually does with the broken prophet. Why does the Almighty bury a punished man with his own hands? Go back now to the dust of Zin, the old prophet standing by the rushing water, the wood of an almond branch still vibrating in his grip, the congregation plunging their faces into a miracle he just broke to pieces. You have read this scene 100 times as the story of an exhausted man who finally lost his temper. But tonight, that stick is the rod of resurrection. That towering cliff is the shadow of the ascended Messiah. And the water rushing over the sand is flowing from a prophecy that was violently vandalized. Sit with that. The verdict at Meribah was not the petty retaliation of a volatile deity. It was the architectural protection of the gospel. If the rock is Christ, the rock cannot be struck twice. If grace is accessed by the voice, it cannot be forced by the rod. Moses was barred from the physical land of Canaan, so the canonical text could perfectly preserve the spiritual map of redemption. The law cannot bring you into the promise. Look at the final chapters of Deuteronomy. Moses climbs Mount Nebo. He looks across the Jordan River at a land he will never walk. His eyes are not dim. His natural force is not abated, but his journey is over. The man who represented the law must die on the wrong side of the river, so that a young commander named Joshua, whose name translates perfectly to Yeshua, to Jesus, can lead the people into the inheritance. The visual poetry is flawless. But notice what heaven does with the broken prophet. God does not abandon him in the dirt. Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 6, records the most intimate, haunting burial in human history. And he buried him in a valley in the land of Moab, over against Beth Peor. But no man knoweth of his sepulchre unto this day. Read that again. The Lord enforced the banishment, but he performed the funeral himself. God dug the grave. God laid his friend in the earth. The punishment for ruining the shadow of the Messiah was absolute, but the love for the man who carried the burden of Israel for 40 years was unbroken. Moses lost the physical geography of Canaan, but he did not lose the presence of the Almighty. I hold this as one reading, not the final word. A way to reconcile the brutality of the desert with the deep mercy of the divine. Moses accepted the sentence. He laid down the almond rod. He let Joshua take the people across the water. leaving his own body in the dust of Moab as a permanent, silent witness to the sanctity of the stone. We know why he died on the mountain. We know why he struck the cliff. But why the canonical Book of Jude later reveals that an archangel had to physically fight the devil over his buried bones? That is another entirely different war. The desert is still holding the rest. If you stayed until the end, comment the word watched and subscribe to this channel, because there are more of these ancient fragments waiting to be pulled from the sand. Send this to one person who loves the Old Testament but has never heard the difference between the boulder and the cliff.